By the 1870s, you could travel by stagecoach all over California. These stagecoaches, with their wooden wheels, pulled by a team of horses, carried passengers, merchandise, and sometimes even gold and silver. On August 3, 1877, a stagecoach pulled out of the coastal town of Fort Ross. The sun was out, and there was a soft breeze as the stagecoach clipped along. The driver was feeling good. Except for the Wells Fargo guard keeping him company on the high driver's seat, there weren't any passengers. With a light coach, he could travel at a fast clip. His mind was filled with thoughts of the dinner he'd be having in Gurneyville that night. The two men talked and enjoyed the scenery. Every now and then the road opened up on the headlands, and they'd look down on the blue, sparkling Pacific Ocean. As they approached the wide, barren space where the Russian River empties into the Pacific, the road swung east, running by Duncan's Mills. Now the driver had to give the road all of his attention. On one side, there was a steep hillside with an enormous boulder jutting out from a thicket of brush. Suddenly, the horses' ears went back, and they began to buck and pull on the reins. Then the driver saw, standing in the middle of the road, a frightening and peculiar sight. An apparition waving a shotgun and shouting, "Halt! Halt!" The driver kicked on the brake, and the coach stopped. The Wells Fargo guard stared. "Well, I'll be!" The thing in the road was obviously a man from the waist down. Well, they could see pant legs and shoes. But the top part was a bizarre white square, a huge flour sack, with a derby hat sitting on top of it. Eyes glared through holes cut in the flour sack, and the thing had arms holding a shotgun, which meant business clear enough. A voice came from the flour sack. "Gentlemen, will you be so kind as to throw down your box, and also the express mail sack?" The two men on the coach looked at each other, but since neither seemed inclined to argue the matter, they complied. First they threw the heavy box down, then the mail sack. "Thank you kindly, gentlemen." Then the eyes stared at the Wells Fargo man. "You must have been asleep. You should keep more alert." The strange figure looked inside the coach, and seeing no passengers, bowed to the driver. "Gentlemen, I must apologize for the delay. You may drive on." The driver shook the reins, and as the stage moved down the road, he couldn't help turning to look back. The thing was still standing in the road. His arm was going up and down. Why, he was waving goodbye. The coach traveled on to Gurneyville, where the robbery was reported. Immediately, the local constable and the deputy rode out to investigate, and when they returned, they had something even more strange to report. There was no doubt about the robbery having taken place just as the men described. They found the place where the mail sack and the Wells Fargo bank box had been dragged off the road. The sack had been cut open, and the lock on the Wells Fargo box pried off. But the box wasn't empty. They found inside, and the constable held up a piece of paper with a neatly written poem on it. It said, "I've labored long and hard for bread, for honor and for riches, but on my corns too long you've tread, you fine-haired sons of bitches." It was signed Black Bart, the P.O.8. And that was Black Bart's debut. It was reported that in the Wells Fargo box, he got about $300 in cash, a check for approximately another $300, and a few dollars in the express mail. Not very good wages for such artistic effort, but this was only a beginning, a sort of dress rehearsal. There were a few strangers in Gurneyville the night of the robbery, and of course the big topic of conversation was Black Bart. Later, folks reported that one man seemed especially interested, an inconspicuous little man with a thick mustache and a gray beard. He was wearing the typical traveling man's clothes and seemed to have the average traveling man's friendliness and good humor. It was nearly a year before the flour sack struck again. This time, July 25th, 1878. It was the stage between Quincy and Oroville that was robbed. The lone bandit with his shotgun and white sack got a little more this time. The cash box had $379, and from a generous passenger, he obtained a $200 diamond ring and a silver watch. Still not very good wages, but considering the satisfaction from such an artistic performance, not so bad either. And besides, this was a surefire way to break into the literary world. Again, Black Bart left a poem. It began with the same verse he'd left at Duncan's Mill the year before, and then he'd added 2 more verses. Here I lay me down to sleep, to wait the coming morrow, perhaps success, perhaps defeat and everlasting sorrow. Let come what will, I'll try it on. My condition can't be worse, and if there's money in that box, 'tis money in my purse. Signed, Black Bart, the P.O.8. In October, 3 months later, Black Bart struck again. This time, his mark was the stage running to Ukiah on the Willets grade. Again, there was a sharp bend in the road, a rock on one side standing up like a giant thumb, and a surrounding area thick with shrubs. This time, Black Bart had a supporting cast. He'd set up 5 dummies in the surrounding brush. They were stuffed with straw, and from the road you could see their shirts and hats and shotguns. As the stage went around the curve next to the huge rock, Black Bart rushed out in the road. Halt! Halt! Then he turned and shouted to the stuffed shirts in the bushes. Wait, boys! Don't shoot! His dummies obeyed. All right, throw down the cash box and everything will be all right. Why, thank you kindly, gentlemen. You may drive on. The stage went on down the road, and Black Bart dragged the box behind a hill and pried it open. But this time there was nothing in it. Local folklore maintains that when the box was recovered, they found a note inside. Here I stood in the snow a-sobbin' and a-waitin' for a stage not worth a robbin'. This note was posted in the deputy sheriff's office in Ukiah, where it remained for a long time. For 6 years, Black Bart made the local, national, and even international news. Then his clues began to show up at the scenes of other holdups that he obviously didn't commit. Genius generates imitation, and in Black Bart's case, his modus operandi, complete with flour sack, derby hat, and poetry, was popular among less inventive highwaymen for several years. So it's ironic and perhaps poetic justice that we'll never know who left the following verse after a robbery. This is my way to get money and bread. When I have a chance, why should I refuse it? I'll not need either when I'm dead, and I only tax those who are able to lose it. So blame me not for what I've done, and I don't deserve your curses. And if for some cause I must be hung, well, let it be for my verses. Bad luck caught up with Black Bart 7 years later, November 3rd, 1883, when he decided to rob the Sonora to Stockton stage near Copperopolis. The story of his downfall was vividly recalled by Mrs. Sinelli of Columbia when she was 105 years old. I remember Black Bart. Why, I saw him for myself. He stayed at my mother's boarding house the night before the robbery. Now, there wasn't anything about him that made us suspicious. He was well-dressed, real friendly-like. None of us paid any special attention to him. He left after breakfast. Now that morning, Jimmy, my 15-year-old brother, he decided to go up in the hills and try out his new rifle. He was looking for rabbits when he happened to look down on the road below and saw a man with a flour sack on his head ordering a stagecoach driver to unhitch his horses. So Jimmy picked up his rifle and took aim. Well, I guess he must have hit him because that robber grabbed his wrist and ran off in the bushes. Jimmy came on back and told us all what happened. They told us it was Black Bart. But they didn't catch him. He got away somehow. Now, Wells Fargo had assigned a detective, J.B. Hume, to the Black Bart case, and J.B. Hume rushed to the area and carefully looked around for any clues, and he found one, the handkerchief, with a laundry mark, FX07. Immediately, a statewide search began to find that laundry, and they found it. In San Francisco, a laundry had issued FX07 to a Charles E. Bolton, who lived at the Webb House on 2nd Street. Bolton didn't look like a bandit at all. He didn't even seem like a bad guy. In fact, Bolton, whose real name was Charles Bowles, turned out to be a dapper, middle-aged man. He was wearing a diamond stick pin, carrying a cane, a jovial, smooth talker with a good sense of humor. The trial of Black Bart was a major news event. He cooperated with law officials, and so he was only sentenced to 5 years in San Quentin. The story is told that when he was leaving prison, the warden asked, "Well, Charles, are you going straight now?" Bowles, alias Bolton, alias Black Bart, the P08, answered, "Yes, warden, I shall never commit another crime." "Will you be writing any more poems?" To which he replied, "I just told you, warden, I promise not to commit any more crimes." Few folks realize that Black Bart was a very unusual highwayman. First of all, he always worked alone, except for those stuffed straw dummies that occasionally backed him up. Secondly, he only robbed Wells Fargo stagecoaches. He never held up the U.S. mail stages. He told investigators he didn't want to get into trouble with the federal government. But what makes him especially unusual is that in his 6 years as an infamous highwayman, Black Bart never killed or hurt anyone. And furthermore, he swore to the lawman who arrested him that his rifles and shotguns had never even been loaded. No one knows where Black Bart ended his days. Some folks say Wells Fargo paid him $200 a month not to rob their stages. But most folks presume he went back east. He disappeared. But like many folk characters, he didn't die. Black Bart has passed into the everlasting immortality of the history of the West, remembered for his shotgun, his flour sack, and his poetry. And now, if you'll allow me a little poetic license. Black Bart, the poet, robbed the stages. Despite artistic work, he earned poor wages. But those moments of Black Bart's glory came down through the years to give us this story.